other things we've been doing also. One thing regarding the itinerance that maybe we haven't mentioned before is that when you send people on site, you need to be careful which people you pick to go there. That's maybe could be a hard issue because usually most senior people won't be available to travel for a long time. So what you probably want to do is to send there your best people, depending on the complexity of the project. If it's a really technical, complex project, or it's a project where the domain and the business is really complex. But if you have both complexities, maybe you'll need to send some guy who understands both, or maybe 2 people or more people. But the thing is, you need to pick up all those people because they need to have good hard skills, technical skills, and also soft skills. They should be able to communicate with the customer, communicate with the people, and also be good people able to communicate get those ideas, understand them, and communicate them to the other people on the offshore sites. So for example, on the first iteration I was there, I think I did a pretty good job, and then I was replaced, and the other person, she did a good job also, but her communication skills were not so good, and sometimes we got some trouble to understand some stuff. But what I'm saying here is maybe on the first iterations, when the project is starting, you need to focus to send your best people you have available and send them on site there. How we synchronize those teams? Well, we here in Argentina, we had our daily stand-ups, and we had daily stand-ups with the customer, with all the customer on the USA. But one thing we had to do first, there were not 50-minute stand-ups. We didn't look for the watch and say, oh, 50 minutes, we need to cut. The stand-up is right there. And you have people who are on a different place, people who you don't see all the time, you don't have the chance to talk with them. You need to build some relationship with them. So you need to, when the meeting starts, you need to ask, how was your weekend? How is the weather over there? Is it raining? Is it snowing? Stand-ups, you need to know that there will be some communication overhead. You have to expect that, and you have to plan a lower velocity probably regarding a lot of things that your communication overhead you're going to have. And also, another thing that was very useful for us was to have duplicate stand-ups. Because during that stand-up were really useful because we know that the customer were available for us, and that's a lot of time. They were able to discuss things that we need from them, discuss technical issues, business issues. So we needed to take advantage of that time they were available for talking with us. But all those conversations were in English. So sometimes for us to communicate, synchronize our work, to say, how are you doing, other teammates, how can I help you, and express ideas was much more simple to do it in Spanish. So what we did usually was to have maybe sometimes before our daily stand-up with the customer, have our internal stand-up, or maybe sometimes after. Maybe sometimes we didn't need it because when we are all together, maybe we already knew about it. But also you have to think about that. You have maybe duplicate stand-up, have an internal stand-up where the team can communicate on their own language. That was very useful. And also what we had were Scrum of Scrum meetings, where all the teams communicated between themselves. We have Scrum of Scrums with this other team from the third party, Scrum of Scrums with other teams in the USA, which were not part of the product team, and other teams in India. Well, no, sorry, teams in India. We didn't have Scrum of Scrums with teams in India because there was a big time zone. There was some itinerants there from India on site, so we communicated. We had Scrums with them, and they have their stand-ups and their meetings with their team in India. Another thing really important that we noticed is that our team was cross-functional. We had here in Argentina, we had at least developers and testers. Other teams, for example, Indian teams or other teams in the USA, they were not cross-functional, they were just developers. Developers developed other stuff, and then they sent everything to QA. And this company, before launching the product, had a special QA system testing, some kind of homologation of the product. During that process, we found out that I think more or less only 5% of the bugs that were raised were related with our work, with the Argentinian team work, directly related with our work, more or less 5 or 4 bugs. And almost 70% of the other rest of the bugs were related with the other work from those non-cross-functional teams who are not working close, side by side, developers and QA people. And let me tell you another highlights or lesson learned from the projects. I'll talk about standard meetings, planning meetings. We also had planning meetings. We didn't have video conference. All the planning meetings were done just by conference, by phones. What we done that was also interesting for planning meetings, it's really useful useful to have low-tech tools, like for example boards, where you could stick your stories and everyone can see very nicely all the stories, the estimates, the buckets where you put the story, the size of the story is 2, the size of the story is 3, and you can put a story and then break it down in tasks pretty quickly if you do it with just with index cards. What we did when we were remote teams, what we did was, well, let's just speak through the phones, and every team on their location had their own board duplicating all the stuff. Instead of using high-tech tools or any complex system that also we didn't have at that time, we decided it was much more better and was really useful to have a bit of duplication. So sometimes a bit of duplication is not waste. It's fine because you need that to increase visibility and communication. And also another thing, another meeting that, well, that one maybe was the harder one, which was a retrospective meeting. Retrospective, I think, distributed retrospectives are pretty hard, and the meeting that most suffer from distribution, because I'm not sure how many of you have done retrospective. How many of you? Many of you? Well, maybe if you read some books, there are a lot of books with exercise. For retrospective, there are a lot of great exercise that you can play to do brainstorming, to gather great ideas, innovative ideas, how to innovate, how to improve. Well, doing all that exercise on the distributed fashion is really hard, and that meeting having some duplication is not, you could do that, but it's a lot of communication involved, so it will take a really long time. So what we did there, well, we tried several ways, several approaches. My only opinion is that you have to try yours. We tried distributing meetings. When I was on site, I was coaching the customer how to do retrospectives. So I was being the moderator for the exercise and coaching. And then that went well for the customer. They liked retrospectives, but then the people, for example, in Argentina, well, they couldn't give much of their ideas. They gave some, but they couldn't participate so much. Then when the whole team was back in Argentina, what we did was to have separate retrospectives. Let every team first do their own retrospective, gather together on the same place, and then share that common knowledge, and well, that takes the good ideas and see what we could do with that. There are different approaches, and I think, well, you have to figure out what works for your company or your project.
We have a couple of other examples, and then I want to spend a little bit of time going back to the concept of or the comment that Mary made earlier about open source, and leave some time for questions. So we're going to do the next two examples a little bit in less detail, but I think they're valuable to go through as well. Another one is a point-of-sale reservation system that we participated in, and we had an interesting distribution in that we had a team, somewhat cross-functional, senior people in the U.S., and we had a couple of, well, all the different roles involved there, but we also had all of the product owners there. We had product owners, not customers, because it was a product. In Poland, we had the bulk of the development, and we had a couple of coaches there that were doing the coaching as well. And what they discovered very early on is that the latency in communication was such that it didn't work without having a local analyst who could take the information from the product owner and make consumable stories or make consumable work and answer questions. So the analyst role in this particular organization had two roles to play. One, they interpreted what the customer surrogate was saying, and the second one is that they answered the out-of-bandwidth questions that when the customer and the product owners were not available, they answered those questions to the best of their ability. So the interesting aspect of it was that we needed to make sure that the product owners were comfortable with the analysts so that when the product owner woke up and got into the office, they didn't turn all of the decisions backwards. And so there was a level of communication and comfort. The only way that we were able to do that was to send the product owners over to Poland to work with the analysts for a lengthy period of time. We also had a fair number of itinerant coaches involved in this organization, and the principal role for them was to make sure that the approach that was being used in all the locations was very consistent. In Ireland, the little M there on the person in Ireland project manager actually lived in Dublin. And so she actually was responsible for the whole product, but she physically didn't visit any of the teams very often. So it was an interesting relationship. Another project on somewhat of a larger effort is a system that I'm actually working with right now, and I've become their roving mentor, their itinerant mentor. And the way that this is set up is that we've got 6 teams spread around the world. We've got a number of folks in each location. We also have, the majority of the people are in California and Bulgaria, but we also have 2 remote developers on one of the teams. One of them is off in the mountains of California, and the other one is in Ireland as well, coincidentally. And what the organization has done is that they have made various different compromises in the Agile approach that they're using in order to make sure that it works as easily and as efficiently as possible. We have a video conferencing system going pretty much all the time. And anybody can walk into a room on either side of the ocean and hit a button and they can see into the program room on the other side. And so we try to keep as much work going on in the program rooms at all times so that if anybody has a critical issue or critical question, they can just hit the button on the video conference and there's another side of the team. And that works very, very well. We also have itinerants that go back and forth. We have a lot more people from the U.S. That go to Bulgaria for short periods of time. And we have a lot more Bulgarians that come to the U.S. for long periods of time. Interesting in this current economy, the Bulgarians all come to the U.S. to go shopping, and it takes them that long to hit all the sales. They take boxes back.
Yeah, I've been there.
So
buy another suitcase in the United States because big suitcase I won't recommend you because you have to pay a lot of money in the airport. So 2 suitcases is better.
So going to the back to the open source concept, and I didn't have a slide for this, unfortunately, but I spent some time working with SourceForge. Do you guys know SourceForge here? Pretty well. Okay, SourceForge, in the development of SourceForge, we decided that we ought to use the same principles as the people who were using SourceForge for their own Forge and their own open source projects. So we had the nucleus of a team in California that did a bulk of the work over time, but we also had a number of participants around the world who were effectively committers to SourceForge itself. And so we tried to maintain, we both used SourceForge, the product, to build SourceForge, but we also used it as a means of communication. So we hung off all the documentation and all the communication off of it. We used SourceForge's capability to search so that any of our Jabber sessions that we had going, and we had Jabber chat sessions going all the time. We had folks in Kiev, we had folks in Japan, we had folks in the UK, we had this group of people in California, we had me, I live in New Hampshire, which is on the other side of the country, but everybody essentially left the Jabber sessions open continuously so that we could have this continuing ongoing conversation. We didn't use Jabber so much during the planning sessions or the retrospectives, but what we had was a little Skype camera that sat in front of our task board and projected the vision of the task board during planning sessions to anybody else who wanted to look at it. And so rather than having our pretty faces on the camera, what we had was the subject of our communication. So we decided to move the task, or we had to change the task, or during the stand-up, people were indicating how much more work they had on the tasks. The task board of record was on a whiteboard with wheels in Fremont, California, that we would roll around wherever our meeting for the day was. And everybody from around the world to say, yeah, you know, this task over there, and you could see them pointing to it. Because although we had our camera on the task board, we had their camera on them. And so what we would do is we would communicate like that, and it worked quite well. We got into a late release of the product a couple of years ago and decided that what we needed to do was to bring on more development capability. So we brought on another team of people in Argentina to help with moving it forward as quickly as possible. And we used a lot of the same practices, adding that team as well. We brought down a couple of the engineers, and you know, a lot of the senior engineers, as Emilio said, don't like to be planted in another group far away from home for a long period of time. Well, true to the open source nature, what we ended up doing is identifying people who were really interested in doing hiking in Patagonia. And we sent them down here for 6 weeks and said, look, you go down, you spend 4 weeks in the office, you go hiking for 2 weeks. And so they would do that, and then they would come back to the office after their hike and, you know, participate in the stand-ups and the retrospectives. So we always had somebody down here for an early part of the time. And we had 2 product owners for the product. And depending on where the bulk of our work was, at that point in time we had a bunch of people in Fremont, California, and a bunch of people down here. And so the way we did our planning sessions is the 2 product owners, one would be at each place every 3 weeks. So they didn't have to travel every 3 weeks, they had to travel every other 3 weeks. But the idea was that we had somebody who could make the decisions where they needed to make the decisions at any point in time. So the planning sessions were all group-based. We worked within the circadian rhythm as much as we could. And the idea was to make sure that we had the decision makers where they needed to be when they were. So it's a lot larger of a project than most open source efforts are. But we tried to maintain the same approach that all of our subscribers were maintaining, and it worked out pretty well. We moved very, very quickly. So going through those 4 examples and how we successfully used the Agile practices in a distributed way, we have a little bit of time left for questions and comments. And we have, as I've proven, a movable microphone. Do we have any questions?
Yeah.
Okay. In regards to itinerary, how do you deal with immigration?
Or are you from the police? Security? Taking CIA?
It's interesting. It's interesting for Americans in most of the countries that we do business in, is that I can go and travel there on a tourist visa and do business as long as it's a short stay. For longer stays or repeat stays, we need to get visas for some of our partners, like Russia. Not for Argentina, not for Bulgaria, believe it or not, and not for Poland. Different countries have different requirements. A lot of people, this is something very, very interesting and makes it very valuable for Argentines to do business in other countries, principally in Europe, is that many Argentines carry European or EU passports. And so they can travel pretty freely. They can actually come to the US on the EU passport and stay for 90 days without a visa. Although the US government doesn't really like a lot of people from South America coming to the United States with European passports because it really messes up their accounting.